Another layer which we will be talking now is about endodermis. What is endodermis? Where do you see the endodermis? The endodermis is a layer which is separating the stele from the cortex. For example, if it is a TS, cuticle, if it is epidermis, this is cortex, this will be the stele or vascular bundle. So, a layer which is present here, this layer is called as, this is rough diagram, this is epidermis, this will be cuticle, somewhere here will be hypodermis, this will be cortex, this will be stele or vascular bundle. So, the layer which is separating the stellar region from the cortex, or a bridge between the cortex and the stele, is considered as the endodermis, and these cells are still separating the these cells are continuous layer of cells without intercellular spaces. Now, this is considered as internal part of the cortex. Why internal part of cortex? Because it is a layer which is inside to the inside from hypodermis towards the stellar region. It is inside, so that why it is called as internal part of the cortex, and it is also called as external stellar part or external part of stele. Why we are calling it as external part of stele? Because see, when we go with this diagram, here you may have vascular bundles, right? So, the vascular bundle is nothing but stele. So, stele is inside, it is towards the outer side. That is why the endodermis is also called as extrastellar or part of the stele, or we can also call it as external part of the stele, and as it is towards the inner part of the cortex, it is also called as the internal part of the cortex. Now, what are the structure of cells? These are barrel shaped cells without intercellular spaces, and these are arranged parallel to each other. This will be like this. Okay, inside this we will have xylem, phloem, vascular bundle arrangement. So, barrel shaped cells, these are parallel, and these are living cells, living in nature. These are living cells consisting of starch grains, gums. Okay, what else we can talk about endodermis? These are the barrel shaped cells parallel to each other, and these are also called as internal part of the cortex or external part of the stele. These are barrel shaped cells. These are living cells consisting of starch grains and gums. In this, you are also supposed to use a word called as Casparian bands. Now, normally why we call it as Casparian bands? What is Casparian strips, or we can also call it as strips or bands. Now, what is Casparian bands? Now, these endodermal cells are made up of a sheet of cell wall covering type. So, normally what is cell wall made up of? Cell wall we have studied till now, it is made up of cellulose, pectin, lignin, all that. So, here when comparing to the normal cell wall, this cell wall is made up of suberins, and these are present in the form of bands like cell wall. That is why it is called as Casparian bands. So, why Casparian bands? It was by one of the anatomist named Casparian, who introduced and said that yes, endodermis is surrounded by a cell wall which is made up of suberin, and it is occurring in the form of a band. That is why we gave it after his name as Casparian bands. Okay. In transverse section, when we see the transverse section of endodermis, how you see the Casparian bands? These Casparian bands will be appearing in the form of, in transverse section, these Casparian bands will be occurring in the form of band dots or threads. So, any transverse section of endodermis, if you see the presence of dots or thread like structures in the center, then those are nothing but the Casparian bands. Okay, this is important. Now, as I said, there are presence of Casparian bands. In we also can see the presence of, in some cases or in some times, we can also see the cell wall formation in endodermis consists of suberin. Okay. In pteridophytes and gymnosperm, the structure of presence of endodermis is conspicuous, and it is made up of and we can say that it is present in between the stele and the medullary rays. Example, Marsilia. So, it is seen in the presence in between the stele and the medullary rays. We can see it is coming in between the stele and medullary rays in case of pteridophytes and gymnosperms. In ferns, this endodermis is surrounded by each meristele. Meristele is surrounded by endodermis. Meristele is surrounded by example for this will be Dryopteris. This is important. In roots, it is frequently seen. In herbaceous plants, it is of common occurrence. It is normally visible more in rhizomes than in aerial parts. Okay. Now, here, in addition to that, if we come to the functions of these are the characteristics of endodermis. Now, we will talk about one more topic, that is called as passage cells, presence of passage cells. This is also one important point. What are passage cells? These are, like, for example, endodermal cells in the roots which are present, in roots the endodermal cells are present whose cell walls are thickened. So, the thickness of the end walls in the roots are towards the external side and internal side. So, this radial walls shows their thickness tangentially, and they develop into outer thickening will develop into a structure called as passage cells, and these cells are the outer cell walls are thin. Here the outer cell walls are thin, and this type of cells are called as passage cells. Now, what is the function of passage cell? Now, why we are studying passage cell is, it is helpful for the conduction of water. Passage cell is majorly useful for the conduction of water from the, as we see the conduction of water from the xylem. Similarly, the passage cell which is present in the endodermis is working as xylem for the conduction of water from the root hairs. Okay. So, this is important here. In endodermis, cell walls are suberin. These may be present, sometimes cell walls show suberin. These may be present in between some stele and medullary rays in case of some pteridophytes and gymnosperms, and in case of some ferns, each meristele is surrounded by endodermis. Example, Dryopteris. In roots, it is frequently seen, but in all the herbaceous plants, it is a common occurrence of the presence of endodermis, and when comparing to aerial parts, it is seen more in the rhizomes, and it has one special structure that is called as passage cells. These passage cells are nothing but a special type of cells. Because of the thickening in the endodermal cells, we develop a structure called as passage cells. These cells major function is conduction of water. Major function of passage cell is conduction of water. Now, we will talk about functions of endodermis. Functions of endodermis, why we are supposed to study in detail endodermis here is, like, endodermis acts as a cell wall or a barrier between, it acts as an obligation, or it acts as a, we can call it as cell wall to prevent the entry of, it prevents the entry of air and water. It prevents the entry of air and water between what? Between the stele and the other tissues. Like, and again, in plants, the endodermal cells are useful for the storage of food material. It is also useful for the storage of starch. In plant cells, the endodermal cells are also useful for the storage of starch. When we are studying the endodermis, we were talking about passage cells. So, what is passage cells useful? Passage cells are useful for the translocation of water from the cortex to the xylem. Translocation of water and another one is the study of endodermis is important because it also protects from root pressure. These are the few functions of the endodermis. Next we will be talking about pericycle. So, what is the basic function of endodermis? It is a barrier between the steel and other tissues, so that it acts as a barrier not to allow the entry of air and water into them. It acts as the storage tissue which helps in the storage of starch. It also acts as the tissue which helps in the intake of water or translocation of water from cortex to xylem, and it also protects the plants from the root pressure. And in some cases, these walls of the endodermis also act as cork cambium. This is also important. Sometimes the cells of the endodermis also get transformed and helps and changes into a structure called as cork cambium during the further growth of the tissue in the plant.